Recall the four causes from the physics. Now, if you recall, when we were talking about these causes, what Aristotle and what we are mostly interested in is how these causes apply to the human being. So that last row there. And when we were looking at the four causes as they apply to the human being, the last two boxes, so those boxes down in the lower right corner, were still somewhat mysterious to us. What exactly is the form of a human being? What exactly is the final cause of a human being? And so we wanted to understand those two causes, those two aspects of humanity a bit better. And in the meantime, what we've done is we've dipped into the Dianima, and the Dianima has given us an account of what human shape, so to speak, is. It's actually the human soul. And same thing could be said about the frog shape. The formal cause of a frog is the frog's soul. The formal cause of a human being is the human soul. That's the quote unquote form or shape. And in the Dianima, Aristotle describes that the different kinds or parts of soul that we have, and the way in which at least certain parts of our soul, namely the nutritive and perceptive, are a functional organization of certain body parts. And so he also describes the way in which at least certain parts of the soul are related to the body, right? The soul in Aristotle's view is not just some airy spiritual substance that happens to be hooked up to a body and control it in some mysterious way. Rather, at least when it comes to perceptive and nutritive souls, Aristotle gives an analysis according to which the soul simply is the ordered organization, the functional organization of the various body parts. And then things, of course, are very different when you get to the rational soul. All right, so we know a little bit now about the formal cause of a human being. Check. But we're still a bit in the dark as to what the final cause of a human being is. Now, recall the final cause, he says, as it's that for the sake of which, in the physics at least, he describes it as it's what you grow into. And so in the process of biological maturation, Aristotle's point is that, or he claims his idea is that in that process, the form becomes actualized to a greater degree. And the various developmental processes that we go through are for the sake of realizing that form. Well, what does that all mean? What exactly is everything aimed at for human beings? What does it mean when we say that living the human life is the final cause of human beings? What do we mean by living the human life? Just like being alive? No, that's not what Aristotle means. And so let's figure out what Aristotle means. And to figure that out, we're going to go into this other work, the Nicomachean Ethics. And so he doesn't talk in the Nicomachean Ethics about the final cause of human beings, but essentially what he is doing is he's giving an account of that. Recall, Aristotle also identifies the final cause, that for the sake of which, with the purpose of a human being or the purpose of a thing in general. It's the good that the thing serves. And so the final cause of a statue of Zeus is the good that it serves. And in the case of a statue of Zeus, that would likely be something like honoring Zeus. The good of a house is sheltering its occupants from elements. And so now we're looking for the good of a human being, right? What is it that a human being in some sense is for? What is a human being's end or purpose? That's what the Nicomachean Ethics is going to give an account of. Now, the way Aristotle frames his discussion in the Nicomachean Ethics is in terms of the highest good. The highest good, as we're going to see in just a second, that's the human good. This highest good is the final cause of human beings. And we'll return to how that works later. But let's start now where Aristotle starts in the Nicomachean Ethics. He starts off with an example of things that are for the sake of other things, of practices that are for the sake of other things. His example, which we'll see in just a second, is a little bit, it's, it's not exactly clarifying. And so what I want to use is a different example, an example that's probably clearer. And so here's how this example will run. Right now, you are watching this video. Yeah, that's something you're doing. Well, why are you doing that? Right? So don't worry so much about Aristotle right now. We're just think about these questions. Well, why are you watching this video? Well, presumably it's to learn the material, right? Something like that. It's probably not for entertainment value, yeah. Well, you might think, well, I don't know, that's a little bit odd. There's lots of things you could be doing right now. You could be basically doing anything else. You could be sleeping. You could be watching a movie. You could be, I don't know, whatever. Why are you doing this? Why are you listening to me blab on about Aristotle? Why do you want to learn the material? Well, because you're taking a class, right? And you're taking Philosophy 130 and you want to pass the class, okay? And so you need to learn the material in order to do that. Well, wait a minute. Why on earth would you want to pass the class? Who cares about that? I mean, I don't know. Yeah, you can pass it, but I don't know. There are all kinds of classes you could take. Why do you want to pass this class? Why do you want to pass any of these classes? Well, because you want a degree. And the people over at Loyola or whatever who have all the degrees, they have told you that they won't give you one. They won't write your name in fancy calligraphy on it and put that neat little embossed stamp on it or whatever and sign it. They won't do all that and give you that fancy sheet of paper unless you take and pass this class, right? And so you are watching this video right now because you want to learn the material, because you don't want to fail the class. You want to pass the class, and you want to pass the class because you want to get a degree, right? Something like that. So you're watching the video for the sake of learning the material, for the sake of passing the class, for the sake of getting a degree. And so in a sense, you're watching this video for the sake of getting a degree. You could cut out those middle steps, right? You're watching this video because you want the degree. Well, you could keep going. Why on earth do you want one of those fancy sheets of paper? After all, they cost $250,000 and it's just a sheet of paper. I tell you what, you give me, Jeff, $50,000 and I'll write you up a fancy sheet of paper. I'll even go buy one of those embossing things and, stamp your sheet of paper, and I'll learn some calligraphy. I'll write your name in calligraphy on it. Well, you say, well, yeah, the sheet of paper you give me, Jeff, is worthless. It's not worth $50,000. It's not worth 10 cents. Whereas the sheet of paper that Loyola will give you, that's worth something. Well, what's it worth? It's worth, a job, because all those people in downtown Chicago in the big fancy buildings that have all the jobs, they won't give you one of those jobs unless you can show them one of those fancy sheets of paper from an accredited university, right? So the fancy sheet of paper that Jeff makes, that won't cut it. That won't do the trick. They're not going to give you the job. And what you really want is the job, right? And so you need to be able to show them this fancy sheet of paper. And Loyola will only give you that fancy sheet of paper if you pass this class, and you can pass the class only if you learn the material, and you learn the material only by watching the videos. And so really you're watching the video in order to get a job, right? You do this for the sake of that. And we're kind of ascending, right? There's some sort of relationship here where we're ascending to more general goals that you might have. And so in a sense, you're watching the video in order to get a job. Now, let's say you give up on that goal. You think about it for a second and you think, you know what? I don't really care about getting a job. I'm happy just to hang out right? Hang out in my parents' basement and eat Cheetos and play. I don't know what video games people play these days. Play video games all day long in my parents' basement eating Cheetos. That sounds pretty good. That sounds like it for me. I don't need a job. Well, what Aristotle would point out is that if you give up on that goal, right, I don't want a job anymore. Well, then it no longer makes any sense to get a degree, right? To pay all that money to get a degree. Why would you want a degree if the only reason, you wanted a degree initially because that's how you get a job. Those people in those fancy office buildings, they're really impressed by those sheets of paper. But now you don't care about impressing those people in those fancy office buildings. You don't want a job. Well, then you don't need a fancy sheet of paper. And if you don't need the fancy sheet of paper, who cares about passing the class? The only reason you want to pass the class is because you wanted that fancy sheet of paper. But now you don't want that fancy sheet of paper because you don't want the job. And so there's no point in trying to pass the class, in which case there's no point in trying to learn the material. You only wanted to learn the material because you needed to pass the class. But now you've given up on passing the class because you've given up ultimately on trying to get a job, or at least a job at one of those fancy places downtown. Well, if you're no longer interested in learning the material, obviously there's no longer any point in watching the video, right? This is Aristotle's point. This is a point that he makes in book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. We do these higher level, we pursue these higher level, put it this way. We pursue these lower level goals, such as watching the video or learning the material, for the sake of these higher level goals, right? We do them for the sake of those higher things. And if we give up on those higher things, such as getting a job, it no longer makes any sense to do those lower level things, such as watching this video, the things that you did for the sake of that longer term goal. The example Aristotle uses to illustrate this point involves horses, right? So he says, we make bridles, which I can never remember this. I think it's what goes on a horse's head. It's like the steering wheel for a horse, something like that. We do that. We make those because we want to ride horses. If we all of a sudden no longer want to ride horses, we wouldn't make bridles anymore. And then we want to ride horses, according to Aristotle, for the sake of what he calls strategy. What he has in mind is war strategy. And so back in ancient Greece, they wouldn't ride horses for fun or transportation even, really. They would only ride horses for fighting wars. They had cavalry. There we go. And so we would ride horses for the sake of fighting wars. If we all of a sudden became pacifists and no longer wanted to fight wars or whatever, well, then it'd make no sense to ride horses. It'd make no sense to make bridles, right? That's Aristotle's example. It's a little bit further removed from our daily experience, if you will. But let's return now to our example. Let's spell it out a little bit further. Because you might say, well, look, those jobs, I don't know, sitting under fluorescent lights in a cubicle, and you got 5 bosses telling you what to do, and then somebody always takes your lunch out of the fridge, and that sounds terrible. Why would you want that? 5 bosses and fluorescent lights in that doesn't sound good. Who wants one of those? Why would you want a job? Well, quite obviously, you want the job for the money that it gets you, right? And so in a sense, we could keep on, right? You watch the video ultimately for the sake of your future salary because you want more money. Well, then we can keep going. Why do you want money? And we'd say, blah, 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 whatever, right? I'm just going to put ... We don't need to spell it out entirely. Yeah. But eventually, Aristotle thinks we have to stop somewhere. A chain like this can't go on forever. You have to stop somewhere. And wherever it is, because he says if it went on forever, you wouldn't actually desire anything. You wouldn't actually be motivated to do anything. There'd be nothing, in fact, that you were pursuing. It's a kind of psychological impossibility. That's just not how human beings are wired. We have to have some kind of definite stopping point, some sort of goal. Whatever that stopping point is or ought to be, that's the highest good. Right? Now, Aristotle thinks you can be wrong about the highest good. You might take the highest good to be one thing, and you might be wrong about it. And so it makes all the difference what we understand the highest good to be. And the project of the Nicomachean ethics is to figure out what the highest good is, to make sure we're not wrong. And so to make sure that we're aiming at the right thing as we live our lives. And so that all of our choices, all of our decisions, the things that we're doing will help us achieve the highest good. Because achieving the highest good, that's tantamount to living a good human life. When we were talking about the final cause of a human being, I said living a human life. What he really means there is living a full, flourishing human life, living a good human life. And to live a good human life is to achieve the highest good. That's why we need to figure out what it is. That's why the Nicomachean ethics is trying to figure out what this thing is. Now, he calls the highest good a bunch of different things. He calls it obviously the highest good. He also calls it the chief good, the best good, the supreme good, and the human good. Those are all interchangeable phrases. They all mean and refer to the same thing. Now, at this point, we don't know what it is. How are we going to figure out what it is? Well, Aristotle notes the following. The highest good, it's right at this point, that phrase, the highest good, is a placeholder. It's whatever goes up there, and we don't know what it is. Whatever it is, however, has to be final, or as it's also sometimes translated, complete. The highest good is final or complete. And Aristotle means something very specific by that. What he means is the following. Something is final if it's choice-worthy or valuable for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. That's what makes something final. And the highest good is final kind of by definition. The highest good is choice-worthy for its own sake. Why? Well, because everything else that you're doing is for the sake of it, right? You are watching the video, learning the material, blah, 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 for the sake of acquiring the highest good. And so it's valuable just because of what it is, just because it's the highest good. You're doing everything else to get it. But also, the highest good is not choice-worthy or valuable for the sake of anything else. If it were, there would be another arrow coming up out of the top of the highest good pointing to something else. And if there were another arrow coming up out of the top of the highest good, well, then it wouldn't be the highest good. There'd be something up above it, which was higher than it. But by definition, the highest good is, well, the highest good. And so there's no other arrow coming up out of it. That's just to say it's not choice-worthy for the sake of anything else. It's choice-worthy for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. Whereas your job, say, is not going to be final. And Aristotle would say something like, let's take a job. Let's say your job is choice-worthy for its own sake. Aristotle would want to say that that's possible, that you have a job that's valuable just in and of itself, even if nothing came from it, right? Let's say you want to be a doctor, right? This is a common example of such a job. And doctors help people out and they alleviate suffering and pain. And you might think that that's valuable and choice-worthy just for its own sake, even if you don't get paid for it, even, right? It's valuable, alleviating suffering. But what Aristotle would say is fine, it meets that first criterion of finality or completeness, but it doesn't meet the second because suffering people, being a doctor, having that job, is also valuable because it gets you money, right? And so it doesn't satisfy the second criterion because that job, any job, is choice worthy for the sake of something else, namely the salary or money that it gives you. Okay. And so the highest good, who knows what it is so far, right? It's going to be final. And Aristotle is going to use this criterion of finality to determine what the highest good is. Now, we're not going to look at it in too much detail because Aristotle thinks it's kind of obvious what the highest good is. He thinks everybody agrees and it doesn't require that much argument, actually. Everyone kind of knows that the highest good is happiness. And that makes intuitive sense if you think about it, right? Happiness is choice worthy for its own sake. If someone were to ask you, well, why do you want to be happy? The appropriate response might just be a kind of incredulous stare. Like, what do you mean? Why do I want to be happy? You don't want to be happy? What? I just want to be happy because I want to be happy. It's valuable for its own sake. There's no further goal. There's no further answer to that question, right? That's a sign that happiness is choice worthy for its own sake and not choice worthy for the sake of anything else. I don't want to be happy in order to get a lot of money or something. No, you want the money to be happy, if anything, right? You do everything else you do for the sake of happiness. You don't strive to be happy for the sake of some further thing. Well, that's a sign that happiness is final. The puzzle, according to Aristotle, is saying what exactly happiness is. But before we start trying to determine that, a quick word about this word, happiness. So happiness is obviously an English word, and obviously Aristotle didn't write in English. He wrote in Greek. The Greek word that is translated as happiness is eudaimonia. I'm not going to expect you to know how to pronounce that word or to spell it or anything like that, but there's this, right? Happiness is a translation of eudaimonia. I point it out because happiness is not really the best translation of that word. Eudaimonia, the thing that Aristotle is talking about, is better thought of as something like living the good life, doing well, living well, flourishing, right? That's what Aristotle is talking about when he talks about happiness. We do all of the things we do in order to live a good life. That's essentially what he's saying. In order to live the good life, in order to flourish as a human being. And then the question is, well, what exactly is living the good life? What exactly is it to flourish as a human being? That's what's puzzling. Everybody agrees, Aristotle would say, that eudaimonia, that flourishing, that living the good life, that doing well, that that's what we ought to be aiming at, that that's the highest good. But what exactly is that? Oh, the English word happiness doesn't really capture that meaning of eudaimonia, because the English word happiness seems to refer to like a positive feeling, like feeling good, right? You wake up and the birds are chirping and it's sunny outside and you feel good. That's happiness. Whereas that's not eudaimonia. That's not doing well. That's not living the good life. Right? Someone might be living a good life, but nonetheless have a bad day. They wake up and it's raining and dogs are barking and I don't know what it is, right? And they're not happy, but they're still living a good life. Just because you have a bad day, just because unfortunate things happen, unpleasant things happen, that doesn't mean you're not living a good life. It very well might mean you're not happy, though, right? And so happiness is not the best translation of eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is better thought of as something like flourishing or doing well or living the good life. Keep that in mind whenever you see Aristotle talking about happiness. The word there is eudaimonia. He's not referring to a pleasant feeling, which is what the English word happiness refers to. That is not what he's talking about. He's not talking about a pleasant feeling. He's talking about flourishing. Now, before he gives his own account of eudaimonia, of happiness, of what it is exactly, what Aristotle notes, why, this is the hard part, saying what exactly happiness is. And people have given a variety of answers. And so what he's going to do before he gives his own answer is eliminate all of the contenders. So what Aristotle is going to say is that most people do not, what he recognizes is most people have never thought about their lives in the way that Aristotle is thinking about life right now. Almost nobody has ever sat down and thought to themselves, well, geez, why am I doing this? Why am I watching this video? Well, it's to learn the material. And why am I doing that? For the sake of passing, blah, 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 and all the way up, right? Almost nobody has ever done that. And so very few people have an explicit view of what happiness consists in, or have an explicit view of what they take the highest good to be, right? Aristotle knows that. Nonetheless, what he thinks is that we all kind of implicitly take something to be the highest good, even if we've never made it explicit to ourselves. And you can determine what someone takes the highest good to be by looking at the way they live their life, by looking at the kinds of choices they make, especially the big long-term choices, right? Look at the choices they make and look at what they're aimed at. Look at what they seem to be aimed at. And what that will reveal is that there's some one goal that this person has for their life, even if they don't know it. That's a possibility. And Aristotle seems to think that's actually what happens with most people, right? Most people take something to be their goal in life, even though they don't really realize that they've done that or what the goal is. Nonetheless, all of their major choices and decisions are aimed at that goal. Well, that's what they take the highest good to be then, that goal, that end. And if you look at most people's lives and the way they live them, Aristotle would say, it seems like most people take pleasure, excuse me, to be the highest good. Pleasure, gratification. If you look at most people's lives, the choices they make are aimed at pleasure. And so what he would say, look at most people today, maybe similar idea as what we found in Plato. Why do people go to school, or why are people advised to go to college? You go talk to your high school counselor or whatever, and they say, yeah, go to college and, learn the material, pass your classes, get your degree so you can get a good, respectable job. You can be a good, respectable citizen and have a job. And if you had a kind of, smart aleck of a student or whatever, they say, well, why would I want that? High school counselor. And then the answer I take it would be, well, what do you mean? Why? I mean, so you can have, you need money and you want to be able to, live your life as you see fit and do what you want. Right. And so you need money. And so you got to go get a job, and you want to get a degree so you can get a good job, so you can get lots of money, so you can really do what you want. You can, live your life as you see fit, do what you want. Well, as we've seen from the Gorgias, doing what you want is just another word for pleasure. And so Aristotle would want to say that people who live their lives in that way take the highest good to be pleasure. And indeed, Callicles did, right? And so what Aristotle is considering here is the kind of view that Callicles had put forward. Pleasure, hedonism, is the life of gratification, the good life. And Aristotle doesn't really give much of an argument, but he says, no, of course not. The life of pleasure is one suitable for animals, or beasts, I believe is actually what he says. And he moves on. And so he doesn't give much of an argument here. But Aristotle was very much influenced by Plato. You could imagine Plato's arguments against hedonism being in the back of Aristotle's mind. You could substitute Plato's argument against hedonism, the coward's pleasures argument. And I think there are kind of certain parallels with the kinds of things that Aristotle says, right? So no, pleasure is not going to be what happiness consists in, according to Aristotle. And so most people, the people who live their lives that way, right? The people who make their choices with a view toward doing what they want, that's a mistake. You're liable to live a bad life if that's what your primary concern is. You're liable not to flourish, not in fact to be happy, not to live a good human life. That's really bad. And so the point of the Nicomachean ethics is to get us on the right path, right? Well, next, he considers, you look at the way people live. Some people, yeah, it seems to be all about pleasure. Other people, it seems to be all about wealth. Could money be the highest good? And here, Aristotle gives more of an argument. And what he says is no, for wealth is only good as a means to other things. Money in itself is worthless. It's just, it's just green paper and chunks of metal or whatever. That doesn't have any value in itself. Money is valuable because you can exchange it for other things, for other goods. And so money is, in fact, like the exact opposite of a final good. A final good is something that's choice worthy for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. Whereas money or wealth is not choice worthy for its own sake, but only for the sake of other things. And so, because money is not final, it can't be the highest good. And so, he eliminates money, right? Money, that should not be one's overarching purpose in life. Money and pleasure. You're going to be led astray if that's what your goal is. Next, he considers honor. And he identifies this with the life of the politician. This, in part, has to do what you can think of by honor here is more something like prestige, respect, fame, reputation, stuff like that. And certainly politicians of our day are into that, but that's really was central to politicians back in Aristotle's day, right? Power, respect, prestige. That stuff is kind of bound up with honor. And look, that's a goal that a lot of people today even have. So yeah, sure, fine politicians, but also, non-politicians, us. We do things because we want to, one of the reasons people might become doctors is because that's like a really respectable profession, medical profession, right? People will, oh, wow, yeah, you're a doctor or whatever, right? Whereas other professions are held in much lower esteem. Being, I not to step on anybody's toes, but I was a cashier at one point. Being a cashier is not really held out in much esteem or prestige, and maybe we'd be wrong for thinking something like this, but if I think just about everybody, if you were, you had a cashier versus a doctor, you would afford more respect or prestige or honor to the doctor than the cashier, right? That's a motivating force for a lot of people. And so could honor be what really life is all about? And Aristotle wants to say no, and he gives a little bit of an odd answer here, a little bit an answer that's kind of specific to his own time, if you will, because what he says is that people who are really into honor, they aren't actually really into honor. They're ultimately really into virtue. They want honor simply as a sign of their virtue. And so then that makes and so for the person who's really into honor, they don't even think of honor as the best thing. They think of virtue as better than honor. And so honor isn't really even a live contender according to Aristotle. He kind of moves on. So lastly, and so honor, that can't be the highest good. Pleasure, wealth, honor, none of these things are the highest good. He also gives a little bit of an argument against honor. He says honor is dependent upon other people. Other people have to bestow honor upon you. Whereas happiness, eudaimonia, whatever it is, it's not bestowed upon you by somebody else. And so look, eudaimonia can't be honor. Okay, fine. So lastly, virtue. This should ring a bell. This is similar to Aristotle, to Socrates. This would have been Socrates' answer, right? In the Gorgias, Socrates argues that virtue is what happiness consists in. That's what a good life consists in, right? We need the excellences or virtues that are proper to human beings. And then if we have that, that's what makes a good human being. And so Socrates would say virtue. Plato would say, it seems, virtue. Aristotle says no. And so here he parts company with Plato. Now, what we're going to see is that Aristotle, in a way, so he parts company, but in a way, he kind of comes back to Plato and Socrates' position. But right here, before we get to Aristotle's own position, he says, no, virtue can't be the highest good, can't be happiness. Well, why not? Aristotle uses a thought experiment. He says, imagine you have someone who has all the virtues. And by virtues, he means things like justice and courage and temperance and so on. So imagine someone who is totally just and courageous and temperate and so on. There's a whole bunch of virtues. We'll get to them in a little bit. Imagine someone like that. Okay. Now, let's say they fall into a coma, a lifelong coma. And so they're just laying there in bed. Is that person happy? Is that person flourishing? Is that person living the good life? Aristotle wants to say, obviously not. Obviously, no. That person's hardly living a life at all, let alone the good life. And so, what does that show? Well, that shows that virtue can't be sufficient for happiness, that virtue is not just happiness. Virtue is not the highest good. Because look, that person who's in the coma who has all the virtues, they have all the virtues. If virtue were the highest good, then that person in the coma, we would have to say is flourishing, is living the good life, is happy. But that's absurd. They're not happy. They're not anything. They're in a coma. They're not living the good life. They're hardly alive at all, right? That's Aristotle's argument. And so this is an argument that virtue is not itself the highest good. Having eliminated all the kind of contenders for happiness, Aristotle is now going to give his own view of what happiness is.